Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Crowdsourcing Sustainability Podcast. My name is Ryan Hagan, and I'll be your host alongside Rachel Taylor.
Hi there.
For those who don't know, we are Crowdsourcing Sustainability's director and community weaver, respectively. And today we are lucky to be joined by Saul Griffith. Saul is an engineer, inventor, author, and entrepreneur. He received the MacArthur Genius grant in 2007 and has worked as a principal investigator or project lead on federally funded research projects for agencies including NASA, DARPA, ARPA-E, and the National Science Foundation. He's the author of at least 2 books. Most recent ones are Electrify, an optimist playbook for our clean energy future, and The Big Switch, Australia's electric future. There you go. He currently works as the founder and chief scientist, both at Other Lab and Rewiring America. Other Lab is an independent R&D lab that helps government agencies and Fortune 500 companies understand energy infrastructure and deep decarbonization. And Rewiring America is the leading electrification nonprofit with a mission to electrify everything in our homes, businesses, and communities so that we limit global warming, improve our health, save money, increase energy efficiency, and build a stronger workforce. So Saul, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, we are really excited to be with you today and, to dive into what electrifying everything would look like on a macro scale. But first, as with all our guests, we'd love to start with you and your story. So when did you start caring about climate and why? And what was that process like for you?
I was very lucky. I grew up in Australia. My mother is an artist, and virtually every holiday we ever took was to camp in some magical, pristine place and try and track the lesser spotted-nosed wombat or, the great eastern pink galah or whatever it happened to be that we were chasing on that trip. So I grew up with a real appreciation for the national parks, the critters, the landscape. And so I always had a natural bend towards caring about environmentalism in the traditional environmentalist way. Then it was in late high school that climate change first came into view. I remember James Hansen's testimony. That was when I was in high school. So I was sort of then aware of climate change, but it seemed very distant, and I wasn't, it was just like, oh, that's a thing. Then when I was in university, I got very interested in bicycle advocacy as a, we need to limit our car use, and that became about climate change. And I was kind of a dirtbag radical and ended up joining the crew of Critical Mass in Sydney, which was me and 5,000 other anarchic bicyclists. And on the eve of the 3rd COP conference in Kyoto, Australia was refusing to ratify the agreement. So we shut down the Sydney Harbour Bridge. So we took over all of the lanes. It was kind of a party on wheels with all these cyclists. It was very unpopular because it was a Friday afternoon. It was in peak hour, and conservative radio hosts actually called me. I was designated one of the media contacts, and I had my sister's cell phone because she was an early adopter. I didn't have one. And so I was doing these interviews with these conservative radio hosts who were, telling me that everything I believed in was wrong. And then one of them gave the police my phone number, which I'm pretty sure is a breach of media contact. So we got to the other side of the Harbour Bridge, and there was a policeman waiting for me and my sister's phone. And I didn't end up being arrested or charged. And actually, that police officer ended up becoming a friend, and actually quite a friend of the climate movement and the bicycle infrastructure movement. And so, you know, it was an interesting story. So I guess that was my early path into climate. Kind of forgot about it for a few years when I went to MIT, because I buried myself in a basement and did what you do at MIT. But when I emerged from MIT in 2004, climate change was obviously really heating up. It felt like we had some momentum, and I really dedicated most of the work we've done at Other Lab over the last 15 years to projects in energy or the environment in some manner or other.
Awesome.
Fabulous. That's a great story. Thanks.
And
And
oh, sorry, maybe
yeah,
to just round it all out. I met my wife early I think in 2003. We were still dating and not married, and I think it was 2007 or something. I said, if the world hasn't done enough action on climate by 2020, I hope you know I'm going to become an eco-terrorist. I just read Neil Stephen's Zodiac, which was a great book about eco-terrorism, and I was like, yeah, you know, I'm perfectly qualified. I look like the Unabomber. I went to MIT. I understand infrastructure and how to just defeat all of the energy infrastructure. And my wife's like, oh, you know, sure, that's fine. And then it was 2019, and I reminded her of this promise, and she said, absolutely no way. You have two children
not gonna
now.
fly.
Yeah, you have two children now. I quite like being married to you. I don't want to be Winnie Mandela. And you're instead of going into eco-terrorism, I encourage you to go into broader activism in the space. And so she helped me, gave me some space to write Electrify and write the Big Switch and build Rewiring America and a climate focused advocacy.
That's really cool to hear. That's
Thanks,
part of how
wife.
that came about. Yeah, for real.
There's a lot of things to thank my wife for. That is for sure.
Ladies holding it down as always.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, and that's a great segue too into your current work and your current activism. And so if you can just talk to us a little bit about like what is electrification from kind of the 30,000 foot perspective? Why does it matter in the big picture?
So one of the peculiar obsessions I sort of wound up with, actually it was about 2008 where I really started a lot of this work, was studying how all energy flows through society. So where do we get the energy from what sources to do all of the things we like doing, whether that's building roads or driving on them or building houses or cooking in them. And actually ended up doing a study with the Department of Energy that really mapped in as much intricate detail as you can all of the energy flow through the entire American economy, and we were able to sort of identify most of it, you know, down to a resolution about 0.1%. So I know obscure facts like 0.2% of US energy flow is energy used in meat slaughterhouses and meat processing facilities, and 0.6% of US energy flow is the energy to get kids to school in buses and cars, and nearly 1% of US energy flow is using natural gas energy as an energy source to pump natural gas through 1 million miles of pipeline. So, you know, a comprehensive sort of view. Having worked in bicycle advocacy for years and realizing that I couldn't even really convince my wife to become as dedicated a cyclist as I was, I sort of developed over the years a more pragmatic environmentalist philosophy that we're not going to change everyone. We need to figure out how to give everyone roughly what they have today, or hopefully something that's a little bit better. And that's a much clearer path to get action. And so studying all of those energy flows made me look at, like, well, how do you do all of the things in this map of how we apparently want to live? And you look at them all, and for nearly every one of those streams of energy. The only way to do the thing underneath that and to do it with zero emissions is by electrifying that thing and powering that electricity with either nuclear energy or renewable energy. I'm not a purist anti-nuclear person, but it really focused that exercise of looking at that map focused the mind that, you know, the only real path for nearly everything, nearly all of our emissions, you know, over 80% of global emissions are from our energy sector. All roads lead to electrification. And the other extraordinary result is that electrification is a much more efficient way to do everything we do. And to illustrate that point, you know, the 1970s oil crisis led us to think efficiency was the solution to any energy problem. So if we used 15% less energy in our vehicles, and if we used 15% less energy in our furnaces, America wouldn't have to import foreign oil, which was the problem in the 1970s oil crisis, because 15% of America's energy was coming from foreign oil. That got written into legislation as the CAFE standards, so the corporate average fuel economy standards of vehicles. It got written into legislation as the Energy Star standards for appliances. And we tried to do efficiency for 50 years, and we made cars a tiny bit more efficient. We made furnaces a little bit more efficient. But the really extraordinary thing, if you go back now and you look at what happens if you do everything with electricity, we would only need about 40% of the energy that we use today to run the whole economy.
Wow.
That's without shrinking the cars. That's without shrinking your homes. It's, you know, it doesn't even require the traditional efficiency measures of super insulating this or driving slower or being more aerodynamic. If we just really just did what we did, but did it all electrically, powered it all with renewables, you only need about 40%. You could then do the efficiency things on top, but I think really the point there is that electrification is the efficiency we were always looking for. And it's kind of a good news story, and it underpins a little bit why, if we do it right, the economics of this energy transition is actually going to be good, and it's going to save us money when we electrify everything.
That is awesome. To clarify something in there, I think you said, well, like this would take care of, as did you say, 80% of global emissions?
Yeah, the non-energy emissions are the creation of CO2 as a byproduct of the way we make cement, a little bit of the CO2 that is created by the current way we use coal in steel making, obviously all the methane from agriculture, and you know, and then some of the refrigerants that we use for refrigerators and heat pumps. So we also need to fix those things, and a couple of those will yield to electrification, like steel making. But you know, I don't think we're going to electrify cows as our solution for climate change. So you know, I draw the line somewhere.
Yeah, and
Right.
I am curious. I know other people might be asking this as a follow-up. So if we electrify everything and power everything with clean energy or zero carbon energy, that'll take care of 80% of emissions. What if we, you know, we're gonna be powering more and more with zero carbon energy, but what if we just electrified everything? How much would that reduce? And we kept like the same energy mix or electricity generation mix as we have right now. Do you have a sense of how much comes from just the electrification piece and that efficiency you were talking about?
I think the answer to your question, you know, you'd get about half of the energy reduction if you continued to use coal and gas to make, and nuclear power to make our electricity.
Got it.
So that is because when you burn coal to make electricity, you only get about 30% of the energy out of the coal. The rest is lost as waste heat. When you burn natural gas, you get maybe 50, and some of the really efficient plants, maybe 60% of the energy out of the natural gas, which is why they claim that that is a lower emission fuel. It turns out to not be, because you leak methane where it's mined, and then that it has 20 times the climate effect, so it's probably a wash. And then nuclear energy, honestly, it's an accounting error. They were trying to figure out how do you put hydroelectricity and nuclear energy into the ways we traditionally understood the energy system. And so when they report the efficiency of a nuclear plant, it's not the ratio of the energy and the uranium to the energy, the electricity out. It's the ratio of the heat created by the reaction to the amount of electricity coming out, because you have to go through a steam turbine that's not very efficient.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sort of artificial in some efficiency sense.
Gotcha.
So anyway, if you just electrified with our current mix, that doesn't really solve the problem and doesn't get us all the way there, but it would give you a big discount on energy.
Yeah.
And then you do really, really well when you start running everything off wind and solar, because you don't create that waste heat.
Yeah. Awesome. I've got one more, just like taking a step back question. And kind of digging deeper into the why we need to electrify everything and power it with renewables. I heard you say a couple years ago that existing fossil fuel infrastructure alone, operating for the rest of its life cycle, would bring heating to 1.8 degrees Celsius or thereabouts. And I know that was based on a study some years ago. I'm just wondering if you've kept up with that sort of line of thinking at all and the carbon budgets around that, because some time has passed and we have still continued to build out fossil fuel infrastructure. Like, how do you think of the committed emissions as of today and where that brings us temperature-wise?
I think this is one of the most useful ways to think about the challenge. There, in the US economy, there's 1 billion machines that burn fossil fuels. Most of them are owned by households. So, there's 280 million cars, there's 100 million gas stoves and 100 million gas furnaces, and you can sort of count them up. And then there's a small number of giant, like coal-fired power plants. There's about 5,000 of those, and there's a few hundred oil platforms. So there's sort of 100,000 giant, heavy, expensive industrial machines producing carbon, and there's 1 billion consumer machines producing carbon. The idea of committed machines is each one of those machines has a lifetime. The average car lasts 20 odd years. The average stove might last 15 years. The average water heater might last 12 years. If all of the machines that are alive on Earth today live to the end of their lifetime, the calculation a few years ago was that it would take us to about 1.8 degrees of warming. I think it's probably takes us to 1.9 degrees now, maybe 2. So this is actually what drives the advocacy to retire coal plants early. So that's a small number of very big emitters. If you retire them early, you may get 0.1 degree better. So you might go from 1.8 down 1.7 or 1.6. And that's why early retirement, any target to hit 1.5 degrees now either requires early retirement of this fossil machinery, or it requires carbon sequestration. Unfortunately, to make the math work for a 1.5 degree target, the IPCC allowed a lot of relying on these negative emissions to hit a 1.5 degree target, and we've over relied upon that, as the IPCC itself admits. But it's a political process to get an IPCC report out the door, and some of the people in that process lobby for more negative emissions. Just to put it in perspective, for they have 4 pathways by which the world might get to 1.5 degrees. The IPCC, they all rely on negative emissions now, but the 2 that rely on a lot of negative emissions need 10 to 20 gigatons per year. That's billion tons per year of negative emissions by the end of the century. Just to put that in perspective, all of the fossil fuels that are pulled out of the ground every year, all the coal, all the oil, all the gas, is about 10 billion tons. So the idea is that we're going to build an industry that's bigger than all of the fossil fuel industries combined to put a thing that has negative value back in the ground, right? It's like economically unrealistic, physically unrealistic. So I think we should pause and have some concern about the level of negative emissions to make it work, and then think back about these machines again and like, okay, what can we retire early? How do you design all of the systems to get those machines changed out? And I also think it's a much more proactive way to think about climate advocacy. It's like, all right, well, you know, how do we help 330 million Americans make all of the right decisions over the next 20 years so that all of those billion machines get converted to electric machines? And how do we make sure we build enough wind and solar and hydroelectric infrastructure to power all of those machines? And now we have a very concrete goal for what we need to be fighting for on climate, as opposed to sort of abstract emission reduction targets. So I think it's actually quite useful, just in a make it real sense, to talk about machines, and then it actually brings the conversation from abstract climate chemistry down to, okay, what do I do in my house, what do I do in my community? You can name and shame the machines now.
I love it. Great. Yeah, well, and that's a great segue too, to like, can you kind of paint us a picture of like, what is the mobilization that we need right now? What does that look like? What's the speed and the scale that we're talking about here?
You would like no one to ever buy a gas or diesel car or truck ever again. You'd like no one to ever install a natural gas heating appliance or stove or hot water heater ever again. That we couldn't start tomorrow because we aren't making electric cars fast enough.
Right.
We couldn't. We're not making heat pumps as an alternative to furnaces fast enough, etc., etc. So, what you really need is a huge industrial mobilization to get everything to scale. Fortunately, with cars, it's already happening. Nearly all of the car makers in the world have set the sunset date, which is the year which they'll never make fossil fuel vehicles again. Most of the European automakers are 2030 is sort of the date. Some of the earliest are like, I think Jaguar and Rolls-Royce are like 2025 or something. Some of the European branches of like Ford, they have a much earlier target date than Ford America. But nearly all of the car companies of the world, 2030, 2035, they'll stop making fossil fuel vehicles. I actually think there's a pretty good chance that those numbers will come in closer to us, because the tide has turned. So anyway, we need a rapid period of industrialization to just make sure we get all of those supply chains up to speed, and then you honestly got to figure out how to build the workforce. I mean, America's probably short 100,000 electricians to get the job done, to install all of those induction stoves, to install all of those electric water heaters and do all the wiring. So we have a workforce constraint, we have a supply chain constraint, we have a finance constraint. The incredible revolution that's happening is in this energy transition, and this is a little bit why the Inflation Reduction Act. Why on earth did you call the climate bill the Inflation Reduction Act? And it turns out you can draw this extraordinary graph for the American energy economy that, I did it from 1980 to 2020, and it looks at the total cost of energy for an American household from 1980 through 2020. And that total cost is was about $2,000 in the 80s, and it's about $5,000 a year now. And that's for their petrol, their gasoline, their diesel, their propane, their natural gas, and their electricity. If you so you're paying for fuels, and fuels are getting scarcer, and so literally inflation is defined by a basket of goods called consumer price index that includes all the fuels and energy and your thing. So like fossil fuels define inflation. If you electrify, the machines cost right now a little bit more, but you have to borrow to buy the machines. But then, you know, if you buy solar or a wind farm today, you finance that up front. And the cost of the electricity that comes from that solar plant, doesn't matter whether it's on your roof or out in the field somewhere, or that wind turbine, is actually fixed cost of electricity for the next 20 years because it's just the finance cost. So here's, you know, fossil fuels inflating, going up all the time. If you go to an all electric lifestyle and finance it, you actually, the cost of energy in your life won't increase anymore. So you can actually now say electrification is anti-inflationary, which I think is like, I don't think nearly enough serious economists have actually wrestled with this yet. I think it's probably the most profound graph that I've seen in years. It's like, oh, wow, this changes economics in an interesting way. And the interesting thing is actually it's an even better story than that, because the things that you need are continuing to get cheaper. The batteries just get cheaper and cheaper every year. The solar cells continue to get cheaper. They're on learning curves where their cost reduces by about 20% every time we make twice as many of them. And we've got to make twice as many, and then twice as many again, then twice as many again, then twice as many again. We need about 10 times the rate of production of solar and wind and batteries to electrify everything. And the implication of that is everything's going to cost half as much again, just because we're going to, you know, at that scale, all of those things will be that much cheaper. So not only is electrification anti-inflationary, it's like, it's actually going to continue. That story only gets better into the future.
We're gonna have to get our hands on this graph chart. Sounds really powerful.
I can flash it up on the screen.
Yeah.
If you want. It's, you know, it's a work in progress a little bit.
Please do.
Here we go. Here it is. There's the chart. I think this is,
That really spiked at the end there.
I think this is the chart for Australian households, but the same chart is for American households. I do the chart in both places. And so you can see that orange line is the rate of inflation roughly over that period. The black line is the ups and downs of the price of all of those energy goods. And you can see that not only does it always go up, it's getting more and more volatile, right? And you can see COVID happen here, and you can see Putin happen here at the end.
Yeah, right.
COVID and Putin are making more volatility, but that volatility honestly can only really increase as we go on this decarbonization project. And the green line here is, if you in Australia you went and bought all of the electric things, that would be your cost going on ahead, and then the forecast for the cost of those things out in 2030 is down there at the bottom. Like, this is an extraordinary story.
Yeah, that's dramatic.
I actually think this is the carrot that we need to get the world to go towards. It's not guaranteed that we get these savings. There are ways we could mess it up with unnecessary regulation or bad policy settings. But this is actually one of the charts that excites me the most right now, and the consequence of it that I think is extraordinary. And I think this is where we need the army going forward in an activism sense, is at community level. So let me paint you a narrative picture. I live in a lovely little, I used to live in San Francisco, but we moved in 2020 back to Australia. I live in a small beachside industrial town called Wollongong. I live in a postcode here, but it's a zip code there. So I live in postcode 2515. It's very typical of an Australian postcode. So probably very typical of an American zip code. It has 4,300 households in it and has about 10,000 people in it. And there's 3,000 children of school age and 1.8 cars in every home. It's like, very honestly, it would not look out of place in the American suburban context. In that community of those households, everyone is spending today 6,000 or 7,000 Australian dollars, 4,000 or 5,000 US dollars a year on energy. We spend $21 million a year on fossil fuels. We don't make coal, in 2515. We don't make oil, we don't refine oil, we don't mine gas. There are 2 gas stations here. We call them petrol stations. They create 2 jobs in the local economy. Honestly, they sell as many cigarettes and as much corn syrup as they sell gasoline. So it's like 3 things that can kill you in one place. So for $20 million a year, we create 2 jobs in the community.
That is a wild way to frame it.
Pretty bad ROI.
Yeah, but now think about, like, and I think this is exciting, and I'm writing a bit of a half a book on this right now, and I think this is pretty glorious. Like, our community with high penetration of rooftop solar. So imagine 80% of the households put rooftop solar. And just like, this maddens me about America, but in America, solar costs $3 a watt to install. In Australia, it costs about 65 US cents per watt, 4 times cheaper. Solar is so cheap here that after financing, the solar on your roof delivers electricity at about 4 Australian cents per kilowatt hour. Think of that, like
Wow.
2 or 3 American cents per kilowatt hour is the cost of electricity from your rooftop. That's why we have some places in Australia where 50% of households have it on their roof. It's widely forecast that 80% will have solar on their roof by 2030.
Wow.
With 80% penetration, and then solar over our parking spaces and on the church and on the school and at the local supermarket, we would produce somewhere between 50 and 75%, maybe even 100% of all of the energy that we need to run all of our vehicles, all of our homes in that community. We would be saving $16 million a year on energy, because I assume we'll still buy a little bit of the electricity. So about $5 million we'll bring in from somewhere, because it won't always be sunny here, and it won't always, the normal things. But if you think about a city with 4,000 houses in it, and you're saving $16 million a year, traditional economics in Australia, and it's similar in America, about 55% of that $16 million that is saved could be expected to be spent in our local area. So call that $8 or $9 or $10 million. But if you're spending $9 or $10 million in a community of 4,000 houses, like, you run out of swimming pools to build and new classrooms pretty quickly. And it's an extraordinary opportunity for economic renewal, because we will be producing our energy locally and using it locally. And the biggest saving is for cars. For the average Australian car, driving the average number of miles they do a year, anyway, in Australia, we talk in kilometers, so I'm not sure I'll be able to do the translation. It's
That's fine.
It's about 20 Australian cents per kilometer to operate the car. If you were operating an electric car, as I do, off the solar power on your roof, as I do, we're paying about 1 and 1.5 cents per kilometer. So every time we drive a kilometer, which is a bit more than half a mile, we save, a couple of dimes.
That's awesome.
And that saves a huge money. And so that's the money that really gets to go back into the community. So that story could be true in the majority of American communities too. It's a matter of making sure that the rules of the electricity grid align correctly in the interest of the household. It's about making sure that you eliminate the soft costs so that you can have the same rooftop solar revolution that we have. But I actually think this is what is going to transform the politics of climate, and it's going to transform it at community level. So I think the Inflation Reduction Act is spectacular. I'm proud of my tiny role in it and Rewiring America's role in it. But I think now it comes down to mayors and households and community members, and what they can do to bring about that future, which is one of local jobs, because the solar, the induction stove, the gas or the water heater, when it's replaced with a heat pump, like, that's all local labor. You can't outsource those jobs to Mexico or China.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge amount of local labor. There's going to be this huge economic savings from the communities producing and using their own energy. Like, this is, I think, the best hope we have of redefining a new American dream, a new Australian dream. And I kind of feel like we have to achieve that. I think that the world is also having an existential inequality crisis. And one of the reasons is that you send all of your paycheck out of your community to buy fossil fuels. When we stop doing that, the money will stay in our communities. And I think this could be a huge opportunity to redefine politics and economics and address inequality in our community. So I think, I showed you the squiggly black line on that graph, and that's what I see when I look at that squiggly black line. I think that's really exciting.
I love that narrative and framing and kind of bringing everything down to the community level. I think that's extremely compelling. Kind of building on that a bit. So, our rules have been built for a fossil fueled world. I'm curious what you think are the biggest rules and policies that need to change, like what regulations stand in the way. I know you mentioned Australia's solar being so much cheaper than the US. And kind of building on that, or this is the angle I'm coming from, what should people invest their time and energy into to actually change these policies and laws at the local, state, and federal levels?
Building codes, not exciting. Rules of the electricity grid, which are determined in the US at rate-based meetings that the public can attend in every state and go and get involved. And we need, honestly, and you can swing these things with 4 or 5 well-motivated people in every zip code.
Wow.
And what you really would like is a half a dozen people in every zip code that just bug their mayor to change the permitting process for solar so that it's done online and doesn't require an expensive, time-consuming permitting process and an expensive, time-consuming inspection process. In Australia, permitting is done digitally, and you can have a permit within 24 hours of applying for solar. In the US, it still takes 3 months. Within that 3 months, half of the customers who apply fall off because they get fed up, they get cold feet, whatever it is. So that's a hugely expensive piece of the process. In Australia, we certify and train the solar installers so they do a good job. In essence, that means that the government takes a little bit of the liability and guarantees the quality of the job. That removes the need. That means the installer is the inspector in some respects. Those things are responsible for the fact that our solar costs us 4 cents a kilowatt hour and yours costs you 20.
Wow.
And that's the reason why Australia will be the first country in the world where households are saving money by going fully electric. So get in there, roll up your sleeves and fix that, America. There are some nice things that are happening through the Department of Energy and others, including the Solar App, which is a DOE project, to try and make that permitting faster, but we need every single shot on that goal. America's riding into the climate solution future on the back of its electric trucks. Australia is riding into the climate solution future on its rooftop solar, right? So I kind of think we don't have the future we want happening in any one place yet. So Australia, we need your trucks, you need our rooftop solar, and we both need Japan's heat pumps. something like so that would be sort of perfect possible. So get in there and do the building codes. Then we simply must change the rules of the electricity grid. In most locations in America, except maybe some of the darkest places in the Northeast, half or more of the electricity will be able to be produced locally, either on household rooftops or in the community. That'll be the cheapest because it doesn't have to travel over thousands of kilometers, miles of lines, etc., etc. But we need the rules of the electricity grid to promote and motivate the households investing in that. Right now, you would like grid neutrality. I would like, as a producer of solar on my roof, to be able to sell it to you, Ryan, so that you can charge your electric car. Right now, that's not really possible. And then I'd like Rachel's car to be the battery for my solar, and then tomorrow night when she's got her car plugged in, I can boil my cup of tea before I go to bed off her car battery. That's the sort of they're the energy transactions of the future. The rules of the current American electricity grid don't promote that. The closest America has to getting to this is the CCAs in California. Australia doesn't have it perfect either in this respect. We're actually just about to pilot a new set of rules in my postcode, which would be a world first, where we get a better rate for neighbor to neighbor electric interactions that'll be cheaper than the electricity that comes from the grid. That's the type of thing that's possible. So we need electricity market reform. Every country and every state is broken in a slightly different way, so I can't give you a one size fits everything solution. But I can tell you the North Star is something like, in the internet, we have net neutrality. No one's emails travels any faster than anyone else's. We'd like something like grid neutrality for the electricity grid, so that no one's electricity gets priority pricing over anyone else. And that's how you would engage the most of the market. The justification for it is the majority of electricity in the future could easily come from our rooftops, and the largest battery in the system in the future will be, in America, the 280 million electric cars.
Yeah.
So the only way we're going to balance all of this system, if all of those participate wholeheartedly, and to motivate that, you'd want something like this grid neutrality.
That was super helpful. So grid neutrality, building codes, and kind of getting rid of all this permitting, red tape, and expenses. All right, so we've only got like less than 10 minutes left. We have 3 questions for you, so hopefully like a few minutes per question here. The first one is, I've heard you mention an idea.
Is that a warning that I should hurry up and I've been too long-winded?
We're just setting the scene. We know you're busy,
Gosh,
man.
Saul.
You got a book to write. But I've heard you mention an idea about climate loans before. I know you've written about it, and I think it's super interesting and important. And I was hoping you could just, walk us through the idea, why it matters, and the impact it could have.
The richest 2 to 5% of American households, honestly, are planet fucking hypocrites if they haven't already done this. So if you are living in a household that owns a luxury imported vehicle, let's say you have a Mercedes or a Range Rover, or if you had instead have bought like a Chevy Bolt, with the change between the difference in price of a new Range Rover and a Chevy Bolt, you could have electrified everything else in your life, put a huge amount of solar on your roof, and you'd be zero emission already. So that is to say that there's a portion of the American households that has no barrier, should already have done this, and won't have any problem financing it. Probably the next 30 to 50% of households could quite easily do this by financing it against their home loan. And that'll be a popular method by which these things get done. And you'd like to broaden the scope of the home loan to include all of these electric appliances, right? So that's how a lot of the job will get done. But you got to remember, it always shocks me when you actually say these numbers, but I think it's 40% of American households only have about $400 liquidity. So to me, this is entirely the equity conversation about the green transition. And I think it's the biggest existential risk. If we don't help, let's call it the bottom 50% of households afford this shiny, better, cleaner, faster future, there's going to be an enormous cultural backlash. And I believe a lot of the cultural backlash over electric vehicles was because they felt too expensive for a lot of people. So it was safer to say, no one wants to say they can't afford something, because that's still a taboo in our society. So it was safer to say I just don't believe in that. So I think we have to figure out not only how do we make the cost of those loans the cheapest for the people who can already do it with their home loan, but how do you extend those loans all the way through to the poorest households, or how do you make sure that everyone can afford the future? I think you can actually build a macroeconomic argument now. So for Australia, I have their numbers at the top of my mind right now because I just did these. I haven't done this calculation for the US yet, but you'll be able to get the picture. There's 10 million households. Once we've electrified all of those households, they'll be saving about $4,000 a year after 2030. So that's $40 billion a year. It will in economic savings in those households. They will spend that money elsewhere in the economy. The government will get about half of that money back in taxes. So $20 billion the government would save. If you're thinking about the machines again, and that we just have to replace every one when it breaks, you know, when it dies, electrify. It needs to be our mantra as regards our cars and our stoves and everything.
I like that.
If you did that in Australia, they're a little bit more expensive now, but after 25, 26, the electric cars will be about the same price. Everything's getting cheaper. You'd need about $12 billion if the government just wrote a check for the difference between the price of the thing you were going to buy and the clean electric one. So for $12 billion this decade, the government would be realizing $20 billion a year in revenue next decade.
Sounds like a no-brainer.
Sounds like a no-brainer. It could be an even better story in America, except there's the if you can get your rooftop solar policy right. So if America got its rooftop solar policy right, this pays for itself. And I'm really building that as a macroeconomic argument that we need to treat those billion machines in the US, 100 million machines in Australia as national energy infrastructure, because they will be the majority of the generation asset. They'll be the majority of the storage asset. So we should give them privileged financing the way government gives privileged financing to infrastructure. We should look at doing loan guarantees, so revisit the idea of Fannie Mae, which was a way to get liquidity out into the American economy, and it created the largest capital market in the world, the American housing market. And we need to extend that idea and the government guarantees of those loans so that more people can afford it to the machines that exist in the driveways of those households and inside those households.
Awesome. Thank you for elaborating on that.
Now we have 1 minute each for the last two questions.
Well, this is kind of a follow-up to that. Like, I just wonder if you have any perspective around, you know, this is on the making sure that electrification is not just something that's available to the wealthy. What are your thoughts on like investing in kind of like broad-based electric public transportation versus the personal electric vehicle route? Like,
so remember,
like
I was a
public infrastructure.
Remember, I was a rat bag, dirt bag cyclist, pedestrian advocate forever. So I'm pro trains, I'm pro public transit, I'm pro pedestrian infrastructure, I'm pro bicycle infrastructure. But I will tell you, you can't justify it on an energy basis. And this makes a lot of people uncomfortable when you say this, because it challenges some long-held beliefs. The most energy efficient public transit system in Australia is the Melbourne trams. It's sort of light rail on the surface of the streets. It's about 100 watt-hours per kilometre of passenger travel. It's an all-electric system. And New York subway is the most efficient mass transit system in the US. It really only works in a city that has that extraordinary high population density, and it's about 100 watt-hours per mile or 150 watt-hours per kilometer. So let's use 150 watt-hours per mile. One person driving in a Tesla Model 3 is about 200 watt-hours per passenger mile. on average, cars have 1.4 people in them in the US when they're moving. So you have 1.4 people in a Tesla Model 3 per passenger mile. It's about it's more energy efficient than the most energy efficient electric public transit system in the US. So it probably doesn't matter whether it's public transit or private vehicle transit in an energy sense, and as long as it's electric, they're both pretty extraordinary. So you've got to do it for other reasons, like, I think the average speed of vehicle travel in cities of over 1 million people globally is less than 10 miles an hour. So an electric bicycle is way faster anywhere than driving your personal vehicle. So for speed, in fact, the argument is to use electric bikes and electric scooters. But for energy, the argument doesn't really favor anything. But I just spent 3 weeks in Japan. It was glorious. Bullet trains for intercity travel, just there's no security check. You don't have to check bags and all the things. You just jump on this train and you travel at 200 miles an hour, and then you end up where you want to be, and you walk out into the city where you want to be, and don't have to catch an Uber or a taxi for half an hour
Right.
from a net.
Yeah,
So-
there are quality of life benefits.
I think we got to do all the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure we can. I think we should totally invest in electric mass transit systems. But, if America wants to solve climate change the American way with electric monster trucks, it's not the end of the world.
Thanks for that.
All right, last question here. And it's just really a wrap up. Do you have any, final message you'd like to share with people listening, or a call to action on what they can do to accelerate electrification?
We need, I'll tell you a story. As you've noticed, I'm in a storytelling mood today, unusually. So I'll answer your question with a story. You've probably heard of the group, the Extinction Rebellion. It's a started in Europe. It's sort of climate activism where you paint yourself red or you glue yourself to a Van Gogh, or, it's sort of non-violent protest.
Yeah.
There's chapters all over the world, including the US. And there was the chapter of Extinction Rebellion in my local city here in Australia. And they contacted me and they said, what can we, they're all adorable young families, and they've got all of these, like, when they get together, it feels like there's 50 kids between the ages of 3 and 8. And all of these Extinction Rebellion parents got together and they said, we're kind of aging out of Extinction Rebellion. It's a little bit extreme. Can't really take the kids to the protest and ask them to glue themselves to the fence. So what do you think we should do? It doesn't feel like it's very good climate activism anyway. It's like it's just being angry and pissing people off. And I said to them, why don't you see if we can motivate our community to be the world's first zero emission community? So why don't you start an advocacy campaign around electrifying and putting solar on our roofs and making us just show the whole world the way? And they have taken that up. I call them the Extinction Rebellion, which I don't think they like, but it's pretty funny. They've branded it Electrify 2515. So it's like, we're going to electrify our postcode. They went out and they door knocked those 4,300 households. They literally walked with their little cute kids to every single door and told the story of electrification. It's simpler than you think. It's these 6 machines in your life. It's your cars, it's your cooking, it's your water heating, it's your space heating, whether you have solar, and you might need a battery too. They demystified it. And we've got nearly half of the community signed on to a pilot to be the world's first, experiment in like really going all the way. And
Wow.
we're going to get some funding from the Australian government and from state governments, but the community is going to pay for a lot of it itself. And we're going to iron out the kinks, and it won't be flawless, but we're going to do it. And so I think what we need, and my call to action is, we need those 6 or 10 concerned people in every zip code in America to organize, go and door knock, demystify. It turns out the level of trust that they've engendered has been spectacular, because they're like, they'll answer the question you have about range anxiety. They'll talk to you about the health impacts of switching from gas to induction, and the trust of neighbors is much higher than the trust of companies. So I would love every community in the world to have half a dozen people similarly motivated to become these ambassadors for electrification, and these people that show up to the utility rate hearings and to the city council and make the changes that need to happen in your town. And when you do it, you're going to find extraordinary things. We were invited by local city council to go and talk to them yesterday, and so I went along with these Electrify 2515 parents, and the mayor is unbelievably excited, the city's general manager, how can we help? And we're literally now sitting at a table talking about where all the vehicle chargers go, where the community solar goes, what we need from council and fixing and aligning the building codes. And like, it feels unlike any activism I've ever felt before. It feels like we're actually just winning. I want everyone to get out and do that.
That is the
Fantastic.
perfect note to end on. Well, thank you again, Saul, for coming on the show, and all the amazing you and your teams and your community are doing, helping lead the way to build a better world. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks to your community that's about to become the global community for electrification.
There'll be a lot of people very interested in this, I can tell you that.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Awesome.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Saul.
All right. Am I good?
You are good.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, go get that book. Appreciate you.
Yeah.